Hello and welcome back to the caves, everybody. Today we're going to be going over the Loki, or the Lok-1, or the Lok-1 Engineer's third primary weapon, the Smart Rifle. And from this point on, I'm going to be referring to this as the Loki. So if that bothers you, too bad. Just like all the loadouts done quick, we're going to be going over the pros and cons of the weapon, then we're going to be going over each of the overclocks and a build that I'd recommend for it. So the first major pro of the Loki Smart Rifle is that it's very easy to use. There's no real downside to it because you can just hold it in and it just aims for you, which is awesome. You get aimbot with this. You can also move the line into wherever you would like it to hit. So you can target weak points with this. Some overclocks that doesn't really matter with. We'll talk about those in a little bit. Probably gives you the most effective long range out of any of Engineer's primary weapons, at least not counting overclocks. Cons are that it takes a little while for this to actually lock onto enemies. So if you have a bunch of enemies really close, this one can feel a little bit strange and a little bit clunky compared to Stubby or the Warthog. And this one does kind of run into the same problem that a lot of Engi's primaries do, and just Engi weapons in general. You can run through ammo with it pretty fast. So let's go over each of the overclocks and a build that I recommend for them. The very first overclock we have is explosive chemical rounds. This is a balanced overclock, and this is an insanely strong overclock for the Loki. This one does nerf your damage slightly, but this makes it so once you put 3 locks onto an enemy and fire at them, at least 3 locks, the final shot from that burst, no matter whether it's 1 bullet or up to 12 or I think 16 bullets at the max, it will cause an explosion on the end of it. And this deals really high damage to the enemy as well as all enemies around it, and it also fears all enemies around it. It also has armor breaking since it is an explosion. This is really strong for the Loki. It allows you to actually have a lot of ammo for this, or at least a lot of effective shots for this, and so long as a bullet would kill an enemy, it will still cause an explosion. So if you put 3 locks onto something like a swarmer, only the first bullet's going to count because it's going to hit and explode, and then that could potentially clear out a whole bunch of other swarmers. It's a really good overclock, and you just want to try to get to 3 rounds and basically use this like a burst rifle, because on the 3rd round it explodes and that deals a lot of damage. The way I like to build this is like this. So in tier 1 I'm going with extra ammo. We don't really need damage in tier 1. Ammo is generally better with this overclock. It gets us more ammo overall because we do lose ammo with this overclock, and most of our damage is going to be coming from our explosions anyway, so that's going to be making up a good portion of this. In tier 2 I like the macro lens a lot. This makes it so your lens is much tighter, but that makes it easier to just put 3 locks onto a single target rather than locking onto multiple targets. I find this is just more consistent at longer ranges. It also does give you much longer effective range with the Loki. It takes a little bit getting used to, but I find it pretty solid. In tier 3 we're going with the electrochemical rounds. This makes it so we get 20% more damage when things are on fire or electrocuted or both, because these both stack on top of one another. Tier 4 we're going with faster lock-ons. This one just makes it so we can put those 3 locks onto a target quicker. It's just really nice. You could go with more targets if you want. And then in tier 5 we're going with the electro generator. This just makes it so we can put electricity on targets, which slows them down, deals damage over time, and synergizes pretty well with our electrochemical rounds, so we can do even more damage with it. Now this one already pairs really well with any sort of secondary you want. I decided to pair this with RJ250 from the grenade launcher. This way I can also have fire from the grenade launcher and electricity from the Loki, and it also gives me more mobility where I can bounce around thanks to RJ250. RJ250 also does decently well against crowds because it can just kill regular grunts without too much trouble. As long as you have the fire on it, should clear up crowds of grunts no problem. And then bigger enemies, you're just going to be using the Loki for. For a second overclock, we have Executioner. Executioner is an unstable overclock that gives you a lot more damage and barely comes with any downside. This one gets you 50% more damage when hitting weak spots of enemies, which is a huge bonus for just a slight amount of ammo lost. And you also can't lock onto as many targets, which is actually kind of a buff because the tier 5 option we're taking just makes it so we want to get to max lock-ons. We don't really care how many lock-ons we have. In tier 1, I'm taking extra ammo with this overclock, although damage is also really good. It just depends on if you want more burst or if you just want more sustained fire. Both are really strong. Pick whichever one you'd like. In tier 2, I'm going with the longer effective range, but any of them are fine. This is totally personal preference. Tier 3, I'm going with blow-through rounds. This is just so that we can potentially get more damage from this, although you could also go with electrochemical rounds with this one too, if you want to have even more damage. In tier 3, we're going with the faster lock-ons. It already has really fast lock-ons, but we don't really want more lock-ons because in tier 5, we're going with the unstable locking mechanism, which makes it so once we have all lock-ons onto just anything, we do extra damage on top of that. So this clears out big things really, really fast. It clears out small things really quick too. Like Executioner is just really strong across the board, and it works really well for just about any sort of job. I decided to take this with the Shard Diffractor, and I took Plasticrete Catalyst with this, which is kind of a strange overclock, but this does work really well in combination with Executioner. Use Executioner to just clear up any sort of straggling enemies, use plastery catalyst once there's big hordes of enemies or once you want to deal high damage to a single target. The explosion is also bigger than it looks. Same thing goes with explosive chemical rounds. The explosions are kind of bigger than they show visually usually in this game. So, or at least the hitbox of it is a bit bigger. For our third loadout, we're going to be using Seeker Rounds. Seeker Rounds is a balanced overclock for the Loki, which makes it so you have slower shots fired. Your gun actually fires much slower than it otherwise would. But now your lock-ons always hit, regardless of any sort of surface that's in the way. They will just basically teleport to the enemy, which is really useful. It makes it really difficult to actually commit friendly fire with this one. You can just target onto this, go behind a wall, and fire right through the wall and hit them. It's actually really, really good, and it's really strong against armored enemies too, because it just bypasses their armor entirely, with the exception of like dreadnoughts, where sometimes it's kind of weird, like on the Hive Guard, it's kind of hard to hit his little fleshy bits if you're not just tab firing this one at a time. Anyway, the way I like to run Seeker Rounds is like this. In Tier 1, I'm going with extra ammo. This is just so that I can use it more often. You could go with extra damage though. Since every round is guaranteed to hit, then it doesn't really matter which of these you take. You just go with either more sustained fire or more upfront burst damage. Both are good. In Tier 2, I'm going with longer effective range. You can take whatever you'd like in Tier 2, though. They're all good. In Tier 3, I'm going with the electrochemical rounds, so if something's electrocuted or on fire, we do a little bit more damage. And we can do that with the electric generator in Tier 5, which we're taking. And then in Tier 4, we're going with faster lock-ons, but you could take more lock-ons too. This one is pretty strong, but this one is the most clunky, I would say, if enemies are really quickly swarming you. It's one of the best at long range for the Loki, because you can safely sit back and hit enemies from anywhere, and you're always going to get value from your bullets. At close range, though, that slower rate of fire is a little bit rough. I decided to pair this with an overclock that can kind of help us with that. I'm taking strong plasma current with the breach cutter. This just gets us more damage with the breach cutter and a longer lasting projectile. Switch to the breach cutter once enemies get close, or if you want to do really high burst damage, because the breach cutter can do a lot of burst damage. And since the breach cutter can also shoot through walls, if there's a bit of a tankier target, you could also fire that through a wall and hit something. For our next overclock, we got kind of a strange one. This is Neuro Lasso. This is an unstable overclock for the Loki. And this one actually doesn't really come with much of a downside, other than you can't hold your lock on to an enemy forever like you kind of can otherwise, or until that enemy dies. Neuro Lasso does have a set limit to it, but for every lock that you put on an enemy, it slows that enemy down. And this stacks with the more locks that you have on it. This makes it really strange, because this is only really good in like multiplayer, and solo Neuro Lasso really doesn't do a whole lot, since slowing enemies down can kind of help for like Steve or Bosco, or maybe your turrets. But it's not as impactful as usually just killing things. Slowing things down in a team setting can be a little bit more useful, because you can save ammo that way and just slow bigger, more dangerous targets like, let's say, slashers or even up to like oppressors a little bit more, and that does help. It's also pretty decent against dreadnoughts. The way I usually build it is like this. So in Tier 1, I'm going with extra ammo, so I can use it more often, but damage is also a pretty good option. Pick whichever one of those you'd like. Tier 2, your choice, pick whichever one you would like. I'm going with the longer reach. Tier 3, I'm going with blow-through rounds, so when we do fire this, we can potentially get more value out of it and hit more enemies. In Tier 4, I honestly switch back and forth between both of these. Faster lock-ons is good because it slows enemies down quicker, but more lock-ons make it so you can stack even more slow onto a single target. Pick whichever one you would like in this case. And then in Tier 5, I'm going with the fear rounds. Fear is pretty good with this too, and fear with other status effects like slowdowns generally works quite well, and scaring away enemies and slowing them down for the team to clean up is actually a pretty decent strategy once you have teammates like, let's say, Driller or Gunner, who are just completely destroying crowds. That works really well, especially if you got like sticky flames, or if you got, let's see, neurotoxin payload. That is really strong in combination with fears and with slows. And then to pair with this, I'm actually taking Inferno with the breach cutter, which is just a solid all-around overclock. Lets you clear through crowds really well. Makes it so your breach cutter then does fire, so that's kind of nice. And if enemies are slowed and on fire, then they usually die from the fire. You could also take this with like Spinning Death. I find it's really good with that one too, since you can at least hold them in place while the blade is just chopping them up. For our next overclock, we've got a Racer. This is a clean overclock that gives us larger mag size, and it makes it so we have more lock-ons than we otherwise would. Both of those are pretty nice with the Loki, and since this is a clean overclock, you can build it really however you'd like. The way I'm building it is like this. So in Tier 1, I'm taking extra ammo again. This is just so that I can shoot it more often, but more damage is good. A longer reach in Tier 2, but any of them in Tier 2 are really good. Pick whichever one you'd like. The wider lens is actually pretty good with this one, especially if you want to take all the lock-ons, because then you can have just a ton of locks onto everything, and it's in a very wide area. It's very short, but it's a very wide area. It's really good for clearing up just smaller enemies in general. In Tier 3, I'm going with blow-through rounds. This one's pretty fun with this, but any of them in Tier 3 are pretty good. Tier 4, faster lock-ons, so we can just get our locks a little bit quicker, but you could also go with more locks onto this too. That way you go up to 24 lock-ons, which is a lot of locks. It makes it so you can just keep firing this into crowds and you have a very long burst fire. And then in tier 5, any of them are fine. I'm taking electro generator just so I can apply a little bit more electricity. But the fear is also really good. More damage is okay with this one, but it's going to take you longer to get up to that more damage since you have more locks regardless of how you want to build this. So I find that the fear of electricity works a little bit better with this particular overclock. And then to pair with a racer, I decided to take volatile impact reactor. This is the magma laser for the shard diffractor. It's really good for clearing up things. I'm mostly using this for clearing up crowds and for setting up just fire on the ground so enemies have to walk through it. And then I'm using a racer to pick off any high value targets at a distance, web spitters, acid spitters, tri-jaws, things like that. And then for our last overclock, we have the armor breaking module. Armor breaking module makes it so when we're fully locked on, we actually get 1250% armor breaking on every shot with the Loki, which is a lot. That's actually the max amount of armor breaking I believe that anything can have, because I think the drills are the only thing that's tied with this. Armor breaking can be really good. On the Loki, it honestly doesn't matter too much compared to other weapons. It's not as good as it is on like the M1000, but it's not bad by any means either. Armor breaking is generally pretty good, unless it's maybe on an explosive weapon like the grenade launcher or maybe a shotgun where armor breaking gets a little bit weird. On regular firing weapons or regular firing weapons like the Loki, this one actually can be pretty decent. It's a clean overclock, so it doesn't actually come with any sort of downside. You can build this however you'd like. I usually build it like this. Tier 1, I'm going extra ammo. Damage or ammo, both are really good. Tier 2, longer reach. Again, pick whatever you'd like. Tier 3, blow through rounds, so we can potentially hit more enemies with our rounds once we go through them. Quicker lock-ons in Tier 4, and then the fear in Tier 5. And then to pair with this, I'm running Pack Rat with the grenade launcher. A very, very simple overclock that just gets us extra ammo with the grenade launcher. Mostly I'm using the grenade launcher to soften up targets and to just clear through hordes a little bit quicker. And then I'm using the smart rifle to clear out big targets like Praetorians and potentially oppressors. You can't punch through an oppressor's armor, but you can punch through like a Praetorian or a guard's armor with this, which is pretty nice. It strips off the armor very fast. And that's all the overclocks for the Loki and some builds I'd recommend you try with them. Hopefully this kind of helped you out. Tell me your thoughts on the Loki down in the comments below and which overclocks are your favorite. What builds are your favorite to run with the Loki? I'd love to hear that. Hope you guys have a great rest of your day, and I will talk to you next time. Bye-bye!